We never called our place anything but home, although Miss Cherry Morton, who developed it near the start of the 20th century, had named it Laurelhurst. Years ago, Joe and I tried the name out on our sons, and when one of them said, "You mean Liverwurst?" we reverted to just plain home.
Louise Howe Bailey was born in Henderson County on July 6, 1915. She and her sister Jenny grew up in Flat Rock before much of the area had been developed. Their father, William Bell White Howe, had a significant effect on the woman Louise would become.
My mother idolized her father. He was a physician and an individual who set a very good example for her, particularly in his relationships with the people of Henderson County.
I did go with my father a lot when he made calls way out in the country, in the mountains. I traveled with him as much as possible. My sister and I always stayed in the car when he went in to make the calls. And one time he cautioned us particularly about staying in the car. But when a half a dozen little collie puppies came running out, naturally we had to get out and play with them. And when my dad came out of the house, he was very much upset. He had been inside giving rabies shots to the owner of the mother of those dogs. We learned then that it's best to do what he's asked us to. He talked to me about the self-reliant mountain people with their integrity and their independence. They had little formal education, but they had wisdom that was made up of observation and experience. And he preached to me constantly, don't be a rubber stamp, be yourself. I admired him more than anybody I've ever known. And when I think of his having the sole responsibility of his two little girls, plus a medical practice, he had a job, and he handled it beautifully, I think. He took me with him, well, my sister and me, with him on a call one time, and left us down at the foot of the hill while he rode up to the patient's house with somebody who met him down there. The hill was not passable for his car. And we were invited into the house. We went in and they were playing what they called a graffanola, an old Victrola, and they had the 8-party phone lines all hooked up. So they were entertaining the whole bunch.
Louise's youth teemed with many exciting adventures, from climbing mountains in winter to causing a bit of playful mischief. But education and family played an important role also, and through those, she met some of the most influential people in her life, including Mary Stepp.
She was 62 when my dad hired her, and she took over our household. She was with my sister and me day and night, and she made many of our clothes. The day she came to work for us, her brother brought her in his wagon. Of course, my sister and I thought we had to test her a little bit, so Jenny threw a loose piece of paper in the trash burner, and it sort of flared up. Well, we yelled for Mary that the room was on fire. Of course, it wasn't at all. She came running out of the kitchen, down the back porch, and into our room through the glass door. And as my dad sewed her up, she said, "I'm sorry about the door, I just ain't used to glass." Never a cross word. We adored Mary.
Mary taught her the mountain ways, how to do things, that like pioneers did, and how to survive.
They lived on a little shelf the side of Pinnacle Mountain. They raised what they ate. They carried buckets of water from a spring down the hill. It was just pure pioneer living, and I loved it.
Part of living like the pioneers while visiting Mary on Pinnacle Mountain included sharing a feather bed with Jenny.
Oh, it was marvelous. The only trouble was, since she was 2 years older than I was, of course, she made all the rules. And the bed was jammed up against the wall of the house, and the roof came right down to it. So I had about that much space between my head and the roof when I got over on my side. And she didn't want me to go across her part of the mattress because I would squish it down. So I had to go, I thought I had to, so I did it, under the bed and come up in that little space and get in. I didn't have any better sense than to think I had to do it.
When visiting Mary, Louise learned to live and enjoy the pioneer ways of life. But at home, she gained a lot from her family, including her interest in writing.
Peg was one of those Southern ladies who visited, and she would stay with one bunch of cousins until another bunch would invite her to come and visit them. And she just went from one household to another. Everybody adored Peg. I don't know how many godchildren she had, but they were all over the place. And she made herself useful, like at our house when she taught Jenny and me. She was just a desirable person. Totally impractical. I remember when she had to feed the dog one night and she gave him the leftover slices of tomatoes, which the dog wasn't interested in. But we all loved to have Peg visit. She got me interested in reading and in writing. And actually, I liked the actual physical process of writing. I liked putting the pen across the page. And we used to have a series of relatives come to see us in the summer, come up from Charleston to have their 2 weeks in the mountains. And my writing lessons would sometimes be letters to these relatives, and I would get an answer. And when you're 6 or 7 years old, to get an answer just to yourself, that was something. While these relatives were visiting, they would be playing whist, and I'd be sitting over in the corner writing jingles about them, which I never let them see, but I had a good time. Memories bring back late autumn days when Jenny and I raced through the woods, vying with each other to see who could find the most hickory nuts. We played out in the country. We climbed trees. We just played games with our friends. It was a very happy growing up period.
I know Louise Bailey primarily through her writing. Like most people, we got introduced through her columns that she wrote weekly. And through those columns, we heard an authentic voice speaking to us about her experiences growing up and living in this area that we call Henderson County.
She spent her entire childhood here. She attended the old Fassifern School and graduated from there.
I got a good education there. I got 4 years of Latin. My Latin teacher was named Frances Little, and she was about 5 feet tall and very slender, tiny little person. It looked like a high school freshman, but she was very strict, and I think it was because she was so thorough that we learned, believe me, we learned. And I found Virgil and Cicero and all those fellows much more interesting than the generals in battles that our history teacher tried to teach us. We called her pussyfoot because she always tiptoed back and forth across the room. She always wore gray or black, and I felt that she was part of the era that she was talking about in ancient history. She was not my favorite teacher.
After high school, Louise earned 2 bachelor's degrees, one in biology from Winthrop College and the other in library science from Columbia University. She worked as an instructor, and during her days in Edgefield, South Carolina, she met her husband.
He grew up in South Carolina, the youngest of 5 brothers, the son of a Presbyterian minister. He had finished medical school and happened to be in Edgefield about the time that my mother was there. My mother had been invited to a dinner party in order to meet one of the Bailey boys. It was actually my father's brother that she was invited to meet, but my dad happened to be at the same dinner, and the two of them hit it off immediately. And the other brother was just sort of put out into the cold. But at any rate, that's the way they met, and then in 1944, they were married.
One day we were rifling through her photographs, and we came across her beautiful wedding pictures. Gorgeous dress with a train. And I said, "Oh my goodness, Louise, this dress must have cost a fortune." And Louise said, "It didn't cost me a cent. That was my sister Jenny's dress. She handed it down to me." She said, "Furthermore, the wedding really didn't cost a thing. A friend made chicken salad, and that's what we served the guests." And I said, "Well, with all the money you saved, you must have had an incredible honeymoon." And she laughed and said, "Joe and I went to the city dump and shot rats."
She had a wonderful sense of humor that I came to know when I started working on the play. I remember the day I phoned her and said, "May I come out and have you sign a copy of the script?" And I, of course, did not want to be disturbing her, and so I said, "Miss Bailey, you only take 30 minutes, and then I'll be in and out." And she said, "Well, I do hope it doesn't take 30 minutes for me to sign my name." And with that, we both just got a good laugh out of it. And I'll just always remember, that's the way she was. She always somehow brought you down to a very common level of humanity, which we all share.
Louise and Joe Bailey started a family of their own and settled into the house that she had grown up in. And as her love for writing grew, she found that her family always provided great inspiration and humor for her stories.
I could tell it, but it was better when my husband had to tell it. The time he thought he would do something real cute on our 20th anniversary. He couldn't think of a present, but he happened to notice in the paper that one of his patients was selling her prize monkey, her pet monkey. So he asked to borrow that monkey, and he planned to bring it to me as a to tell me that was my present. He and my son Bob went out to get the monkey, and of course he had told everybody in town what he was going to do. They were driving back from out on the Chimney Rock Highway. My son had a newspaper in his lap. The monkey was lying in the newspaper. But something scared it, and it jumped out of Bob's lap, and it started going from the back window to the dashboard and back again, with a mishap or two on the way. And they just had to take the monkey home. Well, it never did get out here, and we had company for supper that night, and every now and then somebody would mouth to Joe, "Where's the monkey?" So he had to tell them what had happened, and I did enjoy telling that story.
My memories of the stories that she told are of innumerable people and experiences. And even to this day, I think about some of the things that she told me and wonder how she could have managed to fit all of those experiences into her life.
Louise Bailey had a rich life. It was not always the most pleasant at times, but she had a very rich life that she celebrated in her living and in her writing.
Well, Meade Parse had heard me say that I had given some talks to a couple of clubs in town, and he asked me to submit several columns and see if they would be acceptable. I told the editor that I thought I had enough material for 17 columns. At the end of 13 years, I went to him and I said, I am completely out of material. He said, no, you're not. He didn't even look up. Well, the first problem is getting the idea. And when you have done the column every week for 39 years, it's a little difficult to get an idea. But the Lord provides. Somehow something comes up just in time.
In addition to her books and writings for the Times News, Louise also gave tours of historic St. John in the Wilderness, her church, and one of her favorite places in Flat Rock.
Good morning. I'm Louise Bailey, standing on the north steps of the Church of St. John in the Wilderness in Flat Rock. This is the oldest Episcopal church in western North Carolina. It was completed in 1836 by Charles and Susan Baring. Until 1961, it was open only the 3 summer months because there were no Episcopalians other than 2 families living in Flat Rock year-round. Our church is historic.
The first time I missed the 11 o'clock service at St. John in the Wilderness, I had gone to the earlier service because I had an obligation that morning. There was a message on my answering machine, and I pushed the button, and it was Louise's voice saying, "This is your conscience calling. There was a very empty spot in our pew today." So the next time I had an occasion not to attend the 11 o'clock service, I arrived for the earlier service, and I put a Post-it note on the pew back in front of where Louise would sit. And I said, "I've already been here," and signed my name. Well, of course, that elicited a call as well. She phoned me and said, who else would place a Post-it note in a church for their friend to see?
She had a number of relatives that were buried there, and when she started talking about those relatives, that certainly brought out a lot of history, not only of Henderson County, but of events that occurred in the South as well.
We have here the grave of Christopher Gustavus Memminger, who was the Secretary of the Confederate Treasury during the Civil War. He was married twice. His first wife, Mary, died, and he married her sister. He is the one who built Carl Sandburg's Connemara, but he called it Rock Hill. Mr. Memminger suggested to President Davis that he remove the southern capital to Rock Hill, but fortunately Davis did not take him up on the offer because Glassy Mountain, which was behind Rock Hill, had a great many bushwhackers, and it would not have been a safe situation. We don't have too many people getting the wrong impression of mountain folks, but sometimes they do, and Kari was in a position to know that that's what happened to her. When I knew Kari, she lived at the top of a mountain. A narrow, crooked road wound back and forth and went past her house and then around a bend to the church and to the graveyard behind the church. Kari was in a wheelchair then, but her son planted a garden for her, and she would roll out to the doorway and watch the progress of her little plants. One day she heard some blackbirds out in the garden, so she went into the kitchen, got her shotgun, rolled back out to the doorway, and she aimed the gun, but she wanted to get as many birds in one shot as she could. So she eased the gun around and saw that a car had stopped in front of her house. There were 2 men in it. The driver leaned out and said, "Where does this road lead to?" And Kari, with the gun aimed right on him, said, "It leads to the cemetery." She said, "You know, them fellas got out of there so fast they didn't even stop to turn around."
The main way that she will be remembered will be for the writings that she did about the people and the places of Henderson County. The incidents that she has recorded depicted the lives of the natives of this county and how they dealt with everyday situations.
I remember when there were cars parked at an angle on each side, and then down the center of the street they parked horizontally. There were always parking places. There weren't that many cars. The lot behind Drake's store was known as the jockey lot because that was where the farmers tethered their mules and left their wagons while they went uptown. There was a lady who lived across the street from the church, and she had a telephone. This was back in the 40s. And not everybody and not all of the summer people had telephones. They just didn't need them. But on Sundays after church, they would go over to this lady's house and call down to Charleston where their husbands were to make sure everything was going well. And one time, at least once, maybe more, they found a note by the telephone. If you come in to use the phone, please turn the chicken. There was very often a picnic after church. I remember when it was the custom for the ladies to put on their hats and gloves and go uptown in the afternoons and stop in one of the numerous drugstores for a strawberry soda. Sometimes the men joined them. Only if they had a doctor's note, they could get something a little more interesting than a strawberry soda. But there was one man who asked for something of that order, and the druggist said, "Do you have a note from your doctor?" He said, "No, but a lizard snapped at me as I came to town."
Louise had such a way with people that they felt comfortable enough in her presence to share things they may not have otherwise shared.
And I thought about Clem, who had a sense of humor in spite of adversities. Clem broke his leg, and he got mighty tired of lying there waiting for it to heal. Someone brought him a bottle of ginger ale. Now that was store-bought, so it was special, and he kept it sitting on the bedside table unopened. Then somebody brought him a bottle he appreciated a lot more. He shoved that down under the covers, and one day when his wife was out at the wash pot, he figured how he could enjoy it and she'd never know the difference. He opened the bottle of ginger ale, gulped down about half of it, and then filled the bottle back up from the one under the covers. And what he planned to do was every now and then just say, "I think I'll have me a little drink of a ginger ale." She'd never know. Well, that would have been fine, except that one day some neighbor ladies came to call. And as they were leaving, they looked in on the poor old man laying up in the bed. And Clem's wife said, "Clem, why don't you open your ginger ale and let Marthy and Pearl taste of it?" Well, as Clem told the doctor later, "Doc, it was worth losing my good liquor to see the way them women walked out the door." I got in trouble with the party line one time. We had a two-party line. Lovely lady over next door was on the other end. And I was having the Presbyterian Circle meeting out here back in my Presbyterian days. And my friend Peggy was going to give the devotional, and her husband said he would like to hear Peggy make a speech. Well, she wouldn't practice it in front of him. She said she'd be too self-conscious. So I called up Enno and I said, "I think we can arrange for you to get in without being seen." So I explained how he could leave his car down at the turn of the road and come up through the bushes and straight across to the kitchen door. And I'd leave it open about that far, and he could peek in and see Peggy. Well, I didn't know that somebody had picked up the phone, the party line. But I finally heard the receiver go down. I called Marjorie later and I said, "Did you by any chance get in on a telephone conversation?" She said, "I certainly did, and I haven't said a word." So I had to explain to her what I'd been doing.
I think she found what I've always felt is essential. She found her voice. Louise Bailey found her audience. People listened and people read and people enjoyed what she had to say.
If you will step just to the far edge of the driveway and look down the hill, you'll see a number of white crosses. Those indicate the graves of servants. They were never called slaves. They were buried there before emancipation. Charles Baring had left a plot of land for servants to be buried.
She got along with everyone. She was a people's person. There wasn't anyone that Louise didn't like.
She had a sense of softness that was beguiling to me.
She never met an enemy. She always made every effort that she could to get along with everyone.
And it was that laid-back manner of Louise Bailey that made everyone so comfortable around her. And I'm sure it attributed to her long life. I never felt more complimented in my life than when people would mistake me for one of Louise's sons.
She was a very loving and kind and caring person.
Her way of saying things, her nurturing way of caring about each individual person that she was speaking to or writing to, endeared her to all of us.
When you walk in the door of this church, you feel a reverence. I think it's the dark woodwork. I think it's the box pews. With me, it's a lot of memories with 21 people in the cemetery, 21 close relatives. You can't help feeling reverent. We have enough members to have 3 services on Sundays, and it's growing. We have about 400 members in all. We welcome visitors to our church. We are always glad to see them and hope they'll keep coming because we're very proud of our Flat Rock Church. Well, I remember the dinners that would be provided for parties climbing Pinnacle. That was one of the favorite pastimes in the summer, especially for the Charlestonians. And the party would go on up the mountain, and when they came back down, these people living at the foot of the mountain didn't know them at all, but they would have a complete dinner waiting for them. And just the average meal would be meat and potatoes, vegetables, always corn pone and cat head biscuits. Marvelous meals. People still remember them. I sure do. I had notes about Elsie Floyd, a blind man who walked all over Henderson County and down to Greenville by himself and was never lost. He was born blind. You notice the little harmonica and the key? He had the harmonica in his pocket. It was given to him at a little neighborhood party when he was 5 years old, and he immediately started playing tunes on it. He'd never had one in his hands before. The key and the key ring, it was just a skeleton key and a plain 5-cent key ring. And as he walked, he twirled the key on that ring. You never saw him without it. And you'd see him in town, he'd come up to a curb and he'd stop, run his foot along the edge to make sure that was where he was. And he'd put that key up to his ear as if it did some good. And then he'd go on across. But he really was a remarkable person. because he lived alone after his parents died, managed very well by himself. Joe and I were married in 1944. And of course, he had to serve in the Army. He was sent to Camp Swift, Texas, which was near Austin. And he was told that he would be there for the duration. 3 days later, he was on his way to Japan to spend the next year, and I had to get home. Well, it's a long way from Austin, Texas to Flat Rock. There weren't any interstates. There weren't any motels. I did have a traveling companion for half of the trip. Her name was Lilith Cleo, and her husband had gotten an assignment in Washington State, and she was going home to Alabama to wait until he sent her a bus ticket, and then she would join him. Well, to show you what inspiring company Lilith Cleo was, we had a terrible time finding places to spend the nights. And at one place, I went to a hotel desk and was told that there was absolutely nothing. And there was a lady, an older lady, standing there almost in tears. She could not drive on in the dark alone. There was no room for her. So I suggested to her that the two cars go along together. So we did that, and then we came to what looked like it might be a motel of sorts. And I went in to see if we could spend the night there, and they did have a room, and they put a cot in the room so that this lady could stay in there with us. The next morning we went our separate ways, and I said to Lilith Cleo, she seems like a lovely person. And Lilith said, yeah, she sure does, and what I like about her, she's got her own teeth.
Louise led an abundant life filled with exciting experiences. One of them even included working for poet and author Carl Sandburg.
I met Mr. Sandburg quite by accident. I might never have met them at all, but because I lived so close to them, that didn't mean that I would have a chance to meet them. But when my husband was overseas and I was back home waiting, a man in town asked me to bring his horse out to the country and to keep it exercised. Well, that delighted me. So one day I rode through Connemara. Captain Smythe always called it Connemara. He never called it Connemara. I went in the back gate, and I was going to come down the front entrance, but they were not paved then. And I would go past the house, but out of sight of it because there's a bamboo thicket there. As I went past the barn, the herdsman, whom I didn't know at all, called to me and said, why don't you get Helga to ride with you? I said, I've never met Helga. Well, he said, that doesn't matter, just go under the window there and call her. So I went under the window and I yelled for Helga. She finally stuck her head out and said, yes, she'd like to ride, and told me to come in the kitchen while she got ready. Well, Mrs. Sandburg was in there, and we were having a lively conversation. She was so friendly, very friendly person. And all of a sudden, Mr. Sandburg walked in. And he established the fact that I'd been the one yelling under his window. And then he said, can you type with as many as 2 fingers? And if so, would you be available in the afternoons? So that's how I happened to work for Sandburg. 2 fingers, grossly exaggerated my expertise on the typewriter, but he dictated very slowly. And I had plenty of time to peck out what he had said and cross it out and correct it, and correct my typing and go on from there. He was working on Remembrance Rock. I enjoyed working for him very much. I did find it difficult, though I'd accomplished it, to sit perfectly still and not utter one sound for 3 hours on a stretch. But I didn't dare make a noise for fear I'd distract him. And he did have his orange crate with his papers thumbtacked. and he'd take little slips of paper and make his sentences from those. There'd just be a word or a phrase written there. I enjoyed the experience very much, and I would say he was very patient. My husband came home in about 3 or 4 months, and I told Mr. Sandburg I would have to stop, and his only comment was, "Would you send me someone I would like?" So I had a friend who was just back from overseas typing for the Army. She stayed with him 20 years. A couple of times he asked me if I could spend the night so that we could work after supper, work on into the night, and I was glad to do that, and we never got around to working. He got his guitar out. We had an evening with music. He walked over one evening to look at some books that I have, and he stayed, and supper time came, so we invited him to have supper with us. And we had string beans cooked in the way to cook string beans, with a chunk of salt pork. Well, he kept eating beans until there wasn't a one left in the serving bowl. And then he looked around the table and grinned. He said, "Don't you ever tell anybody I did this." And he turned up the bowl and drank the pot liquor. Of course, I've told it ever since. But he finally won the community over, and seldom has a living author been given the recognition in as many fields as Sandburg was. He wrote about 1/3 of his works while he was in Flat Rock. And then Burt Reynolds put us on the map. A few years ago, he went out to be interviewed by Johnny Carson. And Johnny asked him what he had been doing. He said he had been to Flat Rock, North Carolina, to start his one-man show. Carson asked him where in the world Flat Rock was. He said, "Well, that's where Robert Frost spent his last years."
My mother and I had a very close relationship, and I think that it certainly became a much closer relationship the older she became. We had a sense of humor that was very similar.
Have you ever found yourself someplace and you wondered why you were there? You wondered how you even got there? Well, that's the situation I'm in tonight. And I can't tell you how grateful I am that you are here to keep me company. When it was suggested that I say a few words, I said, "About what?" And I was told, "About yourself." Me? Well, in that case, I thought I'd better start with the day I made my debut. I was 1 year old, and I won the prize for being the most perfect baby at the baby show. A lady who had attended went storming into choir practice, and to the first person she came to, she said, "I am furious. There was that beautiful little Hobbs child, and they gave the prize to that fat slob of Dr. Howe's." I guess you'd say that my upbringing was not really conventional. I didn't realize it until I went off to college and heard my friends talking about their proms and their piano recitals and all those things. I could tell them about camping in the Okefenokee Swamp, pitching our tents on the canal banks, and crossing a city block length of foot logs to get to the boat landing, and some of those logs were just under the surface of the water. We knew better than to slip on off of them because we knew what was down under them. At night, we lay in our tents and slapped mosquitoes and listened to bears growling and alligators roaring. And we ate grits cooked in canal water that was the color of strong tea from the decaying vegetation in the bottom of the canal. We never got sick from any of those things. And we also were in a boat one day with Daddy, and he looked ahead and saw the cottonmouth moccasin hanging on a bush right over the canal. And he said, "Now, if that snake falls into the boat, as we go by. You've got to jump out. And the canal was full of alligators and turtles this big around. I talked about my bib overalls I put on and went up to Whiteside Mountain in December to camp with my dad and a group of hunters and their wives. And I walked mountain trails with the women folks. We sat around the campfires in the evenings and listened to the mountain men and women who had gone a day ahead of us to hack out a campsite tell stories of their grandparents and great-grandparents who had been the pioneer settlers of what we now know as Henderson County. This is the grave of James Brown, who came to this country in the employ of Charles and Susan Baring. He had been a trumpeter with the Royal Scots Greys at the Battle of Waterloo. In the wintertime, the moonshiners would slip their jugs under the top slab, and then the customers would come along, take out the jug and leave the money. But when that was discovered, then the fence was put up and the business venture came to an end.
Louise's stories captured the hearts of all who read them, whether they were about people she knew, her own personal experiences, or the places she loved most, such as the legend of the buried gold on her property.
My sons and their little friends dug all kinds of pits trying to find that gold. Supposedly, Kirkendall buried it beside a white oak tree on Pheasant Branch. And Pheasant Branch starts on top of the mountain back here, flows down across Little River Road. But we've put in a lake, and we've put in a pasture, and we haven't seen any gold. But I have had people come. One man came from Tennessee, another from Indiana. They had all kinds of equipment, and they wanted to dig for that gold. Well, I sent one of them over to the other side of Tranquility, the stream over there. I wasn't bothered by him again.
Louise Bailey will be remembered for many things, I think, but foremost, I think it will be for that voice, that special voice of hers that she shared with us.
Well, Joe eventually came home and started his family practice, and that was at a time when family practitioners did surgery, obstetrics, pediatrics, internal medicine, whatever it was, they did it. 3 sons came along, and since they didn't see a lot of their dad, on Sunday evenings when he went to make hospital rounds, we often rode in with him. And he always said that he wouldn't be long. And he always stuck his head out the back door a little later to say, a delivery's come in, I'll get out as soon as I can. We played I Spy until it got dark, and then we did scrambled words, and one of my sons still beats me in Scrabble all the time. There was one wagon that went on up Main Street and parked so that the man lying on a cot in the bed of it could see what was going on and could visit with his friends. He had become ill in his late 30s and stayed in bed until he was in his late 50s. Nobody ever knew why, but he just decided finally that he was all right, so he got up and walked wherever he wanted to go after that. I think about our beloved Dr. Brown and the house calls he used to make all over the county. Dr. Brown had a serious illness in his later years. He was never able to drive a car, but he said, I've not driven much more than 50,000 miles since. He was to see no night patients, but I've seen only those who needed a doctor's help. He was to do no more obstetrics, but he said my count has increased from 5,786 to 6,080, and he delivered twins on his 92nd birthday.
Louise received many awards over the years for her writings and contributions to Henderson County. She has a room dedicated to her works at Blue Ridge Community College with copies of her column, photos, and souvenirs from some of her stories. A room was named in her honor at the Henderson County Heritage Museum, and Tom Orr even wrote a play about her life and memories.
She always carried with her a certain elegance and a certain pride, but at the same time she was very humble and very gratified by any kind of recognition or any kind of praise.
Louise personified graciousness.
Well, I'm constantly amazed. I really am. I'm very, very much flattered by that, very honored.
Louise Bailey wrote so many columns that I could actually see. And so it was not a difficult problem for me to transcribe from a column narrative to a stage play some of the material that she wrote about, because it was so vivid in my imagination. It lent itself to the dramatic mode, and if you read it, you'll know what I'm talking about. When she takes you on a trip with her father out into the different parts of the county, you're with her, and you start seeing the streets and the people, and when she introduces you to people like Mary, you see this pioneer woman.
It was a wintertime Saturday that began when Joe sighed within the covers, stifled a yawn, and said, "Lucky you, you get to spend a long, quiet day at home." It ended with our three boys in bed after one of the most active days of their lives, with 3 visiting playmates. There I was in the house with 6 little boys. Joe made his habitually cheery phone call, "Everything quiet?" meaning that he would take the shortest route from the hospital to the supper table. He arrived around 10 o'clock. When the meal was over, I filled the tub to spout level and plunged in. The water was stone cold. Blue and shivering, I shuffled in to where he had the volume of a TV Western turned high enough to entertain the entire community if the windows had been open. He was dimly visible through a screen of cigar smoke and oblivious to periodic cascades of ashes falling all around him. Casting rods, fly rods, reels, miles of fishing line, every piece of equipment he owned or had borrowed in years past lay on chairs, tables, carpeting. A grin shone through the smoke. "I'm getting it ready," he said. "April will be here before we know it." We planned to go to Florida in April, and it was already January. The phone rang. Joe untangled himself from fishing line and said to the emergency room nurse, "I'll be right there." As he bolted toward the door, he called to me through teeth clenched to keep the cigar from slipping. "I don't know when I'll be back, but if I'm not here in the morning, don't you let the boys touch a thing." So much for my long, quiet day at home. Next morning, as I gathered up all that paraphernalia, I found a certain solace in the words of a fellow who once heard me groan over a pile of laundry facing me. He said, "Well, ain't that what you're here for?" Then he looked me in the eye and he said, "Do you know, if it wasn't for men, there wouldn't be a thing in this world for a woman to do." I found one man who had a bushy white mustache that grew at a decided angle. I couldn't understand why until I saw him on the street one day. He stepped over to the curb and let out a stream of tobacco juice, and then he wiped his mouth, always in the same way. I saw a very tall, erect man who always wore a black felt hat with an uncreased crown and a straight brim. The hat was about 2 sizes too big, but the tops of his ears turned down and kept it from falling over his eyes.
Louise had an affinity for Pinnacle Mountain, and just months before we lost Louise, she and her son Joe and I had occasion to drive up there. We were in search of the trailhead to the step home, and while we were on that journey, we took a tour around Pinnacle Mountain, and every time we caught a glimpse of the views through the thickets of trees and laurels, Louise wore that beautiful smile and that reflective look in her beautiful blue eyes.
St. John in the Wilderness was also another favorite spot of hers. She knew quite a few people that had been part of that parish.
Anything to do with nature, unspoiled nature, pleased Louise.
Laurelhurst Estate, where she lived, was her most favorite place because that's where she lived. She really cherished that property because of the memories that it had, not only of her own childhood, but of the family members that had lived there with her.
Whenever Louise walked into a restaurant or a commercial facility or down Main Street, she was always greeted with the same manner of grace and friendliness that she extended to other people.
Louise Bailey, I think, was a generous person, a kind person, a person who believed in the mountain idea that you get up and shake yourself off after defeat and you move on to greater things and to new challenges.
Louise dwelled on and focused on the joy of life, the beauty, and there is still much of that in this world, and that's what pleased Louise.
And as for a sense of humor, I agree with William A. Ward, who said a sense of humor helps us overlook the unbecoming, understand the unconventional, tolerate the unexpected, and outlast the unbearable. You know, I think I know why I came here tonight, and thank you so much for being here with me.
When I hear the name Louise Bailey, and whenever I think of Louise, the first things that come to my mind are those twinkling eyes and that sweet smile. I guess then would come the wit and the intelligence and the compassion and the humility. But mention the name and I always see those twinkling eyes and that beautiful smile, sometimes a wry smile, and I miss her terribly.
My mother taught me patience. People need to be accepted for what they are and not for what you expect them to be. Everyone has value. Listen to what they have to say. There's oftentimes a very good lesson that can be learned from the experiences that they have had throughout their lifetimes.
The journey I took to visit her and get a signed copy of the script, Reflections, turned out to be the most memorable because of the time it came. I traveled up that laurel-lined drive up to the home, entered her home, and saw her sitting there in her chair with her legal pad, which she used to write, and surrounded by all her books and pictures of her family. I don't know, I just felt that I was entering a really very wonderful moment in my life. And I sat down with her, and although I was only there briefly, I showed her the pictures of the play. I showed her pictures, and she'd point out things and say, I like that, or this was nice, or whatever. And I thought that was lovely, but she was always so gracious, and even though the play was her, she said it was such a compliment, and she said, I don't deserve that kind of praise, and she was so humble. That came about 2 weeks before her death, and I was shocked that it was timed in such a way that it was so close to her end. I did not know it, of course, at the time, or even felt like it was anywhere near, but the timing of that was just very memorable, very touching. I'm so glad we were able to say to Louise Bailey, we thank you.
I've never known anyone like Louise Bailey. Probably the most elegant, gracious, funny, talented, warm, beautiful.
Fun-loving, witty, very loving and caring.
Independence, mountain spirit, loyalty, truthfulness, poise, and grace.
I call this piece Louise, immortal along the ridges. Ne'er your legend, nor ever your memory, shall fade from us left behind. We shall forever take solace in your chuckle, as we pause creekside each time. Sensing the whir of hummingbird wings, we'll savor your presence nearby. And in woodland blossoms each springtime, we'll discover your elegant smile.
Upon the snow-clad mountaintop we stand. A crescent moon has drawn her golden tresses from o'er the misty veils of shattered land. 'Tis late. The mists of night fall on our faces. The valley down below is hid from sight.